The royal guards have always been symbols of strength and discipline, known across the world for their famous, unshakable composure. These guards stand tall and unmoving, no matter what is happening around them, whether it's the loud sounds of a busy crowd, the heat of a summer day, or the freezing cold of winter. They stay in perfect formation, always looking forward. Their job is to protect the royal family, but also to serve as a symbol of stability, tradition, and order. For many, the royal guard is a mystery. What makes them so still, so perfect in their actions, and so unflinching in the face of anything? It's not just the uniforms they wear. Majestic red coats, shiny black boots, tall hats, and polished weapons. It's the way they behave. They stand in place for hours at a time, without showing any emotion. The crowds who come to watch the royal ceremonies can't help but stare in awe, trying to spot even the smallest change in expression. But there is none. The royal guards are trained to be perfect. Among them is one young man named Thomas. He is in his early 20s, with a look of quiet confidence in his eyes. He had always dreamed of being part of the royal guard, ever since he was a young boy watching the soldiers march at the front of the royal palace. The royal guard represents everything he values: discipline, duty, honor, and sacrifice. So, when Thomas finally joined the ranks, it felt like he had achieved something truly important. He had been training for months before earning his position. The training was tough, perhaps even harder than he had imagined. It was more than just standing still for long hours. It was about controlling every aspect of his body and mind. He learned to keep his face expressionless, even when things were difficult. No matter what discomfort he felt, he could not show it. His job was not just to protect the royal family, but to do so without ever breaking character, no matter how much the world around him changed. Thomas's days were filled with intense focus. He would wake up early, dressed in his uniform, ready to go out and perform his duties. He would march in perfect synchrony with the other guards, his every step in tune with theirs. During the public ceremonies, he would stand proudly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, paying attention to nothing but the mission. The sound of marching feet, the rustle of the crowd, and even the heat of the sun did nothing to break his concentration. He was trained to stand like a statue, never shifting, never reacting. At first, it felt almost natural. His training had been so thorough, and he had learned to ignore the outside world so well that nothing seemed to bother him. He could easily ignore the sounds of children laughing, the whispers of the tourists, or the hot rays of the sun shining down on him. But as the months went by, Thomas started to realize that the life of a royal guard wasn't as simple as it seemed. Being part of something so historic, so public, came with its own set of challenges. There were moments when he would feel a longing to break free from the rigid rules, to smile or laugh like the people he saw every day. But he never did. He understood the importance of his role. His purpose was greater than himself. One of the hardest parts of his duty was standing still for hours at a time. There were many times when the long days seemed endless. Sometimes, when standing in the hot sun or in the cold wind, he would feel the weight of the uniform, the tightness of his boots, and the sweat dripping down his face. But he had been taught not to let these things distract him. He had to keep his emotions in check, no matter how badly his body ached or how much his mind wanted to wander. For him, being a royal guard wasn't just a job, it was an identity, and he had to honor it every moment of the day. Even when the ceremonies were over, Thomas's duty didn't end. He had to stay alert, always ready to jump into action if something were to go wrong. The royal family trusted the guards to protect them, and they could never let their guard down, not for a single moment. This level of responsibility was a heavy burden, but it was one Thomas wore with pride. He felt a deep sense of loyalty to the royal family, to the country, and to the centuries of tradition that had shaped the Royal Guard into what it was today. But, despite his dedication, Thomas was human. He wasn't just a soldier or a symbol. He had his own thoughts and emotions, just like everyone else. There were times when he would watch the crowd during the ceremonies and wonder what it would be like to be one of them, free to move, laugh, and speak without restriction. He sometimes felt like an outsider, stuck in a world of formality and silence. But he never let these thoughts show. He knew the importance of his role and would not allow himself to be distracted by personal feelings. However, over time, Thomas started to notice something else, something he hadn't expected. The people who came to see the Royal Guards weren't just interested in the tradition or the history. They were drawn to the Guards' dedication, their silence, and their strength. But there was more to it than that. The public admired the Guards, not just for their discipline, but because they seemed to stand for something deeper. The idea of duty above all else. Even personal comfort. This realization helped Thomas understand his role even more. It wasn't just about standing still. It was about being a part of something much bigger than himself. He was a living, breathing part of a tradition that had lasted for generations. He was part of something that gave people a sense of pride, a sense of stability in an ever-changing world. But even as he continued to perform his duties with pride and discipline, there was a small part of him that began to wonder. What would happen if he showed just a small glimpse of who he truly was underneath the uniform? Could he still be a Royal Guard if he let his humanity show? If he allowed himself to feel the same emotions that everyone else did? For now, he kept those thoughts to himself. The life of a Royal Guard was not about asking questions. It was about doing the job, day after day, without ever wavering. It was about being part of something bigger, something more meaningful than just one person's story. It was about discipline, tradition, and honor. But deep down, Thomas knew that no matter how strong his training was, he was still a person who cared, who had feelings, and who sometimes wondered what it would be like to break character, even for just a moment. It was a bright, hot day in late summer, and the streets surrounding the royal palace were crowded with tourists and locals, eager to see the royal procession. The air was thick with excitement, but it was also thick with heat. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden light over the scene. The crowd buzzed with energy. The sound of laughter, chattering, and the occasional shout filling the air. The royal guards stood in formation, silent and unmoving, as they always did, ready for the royal family to make their grand appearance. For Thomas and the other guards, this was just another day in their long, disciplined routine. They had experienced many such days before standing in formation for hours, surrounded by thousands of people, maintaining their composure through every distraction imaginable. The heat, the noise, the shuffling of feet, it all became background noise, fading into the distance as they focused on their duty. Thomas felt the sweat begin to trickle down his back as the day wore on. His boots were heavy, and the thick red coat felt like it weighed a ton in the sweltering heat. His neck was stiff from holding his head perfectly straight, and his feet ached from standing still for so long. But this was his duty. This was what he had signed up for, and he would endure it as he always did. He kept his eyes forward, his expression blank, just as he had been trained to do. However, there was something different about this particular day. The air felt heavier than usual. The crowd, while still excited, seemed to be growing more restless under the harsh sun. Thomas could hear the faint murmurs of discomfort as people shifted in place, trying to find relief from the heat. He could feel the heat of the pavement beneath his boots, and he knew the others around him were feeling it too. But still, they stood firm, not a single guard moving or showing any sign of distress. Then, in the middle of this tense stillness, something unexpected happened. There was a sudden cry from the crowd, a sharp, worried shout that cut through the noise. Thomas's eyes flicked briefly to the source of the disturbance, but he quickly refocused. maintaining his stoic posture. He could hear people murmuring now, and some began to call out in alarm. It was a voice of panic, and that alone was enough to make his heart beat a little faster. Something was wrong. The shout came again, louder this time. Thomas saw a figure in the crowd, a young child, collapse onto the ground. There was a moment of complete silence, as if the world itself held its breath. The crowd parted as people rushed to the child's side. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down for Thomas. His training told him to stay in position, to ignore anything outside of his immediate surroundings. But then, a small, almost imperceptible shift happened within him. He could feel the child's distress from where he stood. He could hear the worried voices of the parents, calling for help, their voices tinged with panic. Without thinking, Thomas took a small step forward, just enough to close the distance between him and the child. His instincts kicked in before his mind had the chance to catch up. He could feel his heart racing now, his pulse pounding in his ears. The heat and the discomfort of his uniform seemed to melt away as he focused entirely on the child lying in the middle of the street. The child's face was pale, and there was a faint tremor in their tiny body. "Get help!" someone shouted, and it was enough to snap Thomas out of his daze. His body moved before he could think about it. He wasn't sure if he was still following orders, or if he was simply reacting to the situation. His training told him to be unmoving, unfeeling, and to never break character. But the sight of the helpless child overwhelmed him in a way he couldn't ignore. Without hesitating, Thomas moved towards the child, his stiff, practiced movements now replaced with a sense of urgency. As he knelt beside the child, he felt a rush of emotion flood through him. He wasn't thinking about being a royal guard anymore. He wasn't thinking about the thousands of people watching, or about his own rigid training. He was thinking only of the child, and how badly they needed help. The crowd had begun to move in closer, their concern growing as the child remained motionless on the ground. Thomas felt another hand on his shoulder. He glanced up to see another guard, standing just a few feet away. This guard was the same as Thomas, stoic, silent, always in control. But now, there was an unmistakable look of concern in his eyes. Without a word, the other guard bent down beside Thomas and began to assist. Together, they gently lifted the child, their movements careful and practiced, but filled with tenderness. As they moved the child away from the crowd, Thomas could feel the weight of their tiny body in his arms. The moment was surreal. He wasn't sure if he was breaking the rules or doing exactly what he was meant to do. His mind raced, but his body moved with precision, working together with the other guards to get the child the help they needed. The sound of the crowd seemed distant now. Thomas could hear nothing but the steady thud of his own heart in his chest. The other guards moved in formation around him, creating a protective circle to shield the child from further harm and the chaos of the crowd. In that moment, the rigid discipline of the royal guard seemed to fade into the background, replaced by something much more human: compassion, empathy, and care. The child's parents rushed to their side, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. They reached out to touch their child, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. Thomas stayed nearby, his posture still firm, but his heart was no longer focused on standing still. It was focused on the child, on making sure they were safe. He couldn't help but glance at the parents, exchanging a brief look of understanding. They didn't need to say anything. The gratitude in their eyes spoke volumes. As the child began to stir, their small body waking up, the crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. The tension in the air seemed to lift as the child blinked and looked around, confused but alive. The parents gently held their child, murmuring soft words of comfort. Thomas stood back, his face still as emotionless as ever, but inside, his heart was swelling with a feeling he hadn't expected. It wasn't about duty or tradition anymore. It was about the simple, powerful act of helping someone in need. The guards began to return to their positions, their faces once again set in stone, their bodies rigid as they resumed their duty. But there was something different in the air now. The crowd, who had been watching in silence, now began to applaud. The loud clapping echoed through the streets, a wave of gratitude for the guards' quick thinking and their unexpected humanity. It was the first time in Thomas's career as a royal guard that he had seen this kind of reaction. Normally, the public's attention was on the royal family. But today, it was on the guards, on their compassion and willingness to step out of the strict roles they had always played. Thomas stood silently, his heart still racing, but with a quiet sense of pride swelling within him. For the first time, he felt a connection to the crowd that went beyond the uniform, beyond the traditions. He had broken character in a way he hadn't expected, and yet, it had felt completely right. Moment. And for the first time, Thomas felt a sense of relief. He had been worried that his actions had been a mistake, but now he realized that perhaps he had done something more important than following the rules. He had done what was right. The rest of the guards were silent, processing the captain's words. Thomas could see that they were all thinking the same thing. Perhaps this was a turning point. Perhaps the Royal Guard wasn't just about discipline and order. Perhaps there was more room for humanity in their roles than they had ever thought possible. Over the next few days, the mood in the barracks shifted. While the other guards still maintained their usual composure, there was a quiet understanding that had developed among them. They didn't talk much about the incident, but the air felt different. There was a sense of camaraderie, a sense that they were all in this together, not just as soldiers, but as people. And outside the barracks, the public's perception of the Royal Guard had shifted too. The incident with the child had gone viral, shared across social media and news outlets. People were talking about the guards' unexpected act of kindness, about how they had stepped outside of their strict roles to help a child in need. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were impressed, even moved, by the guards' display of humanity. For Thomas, the world had changed in ways he couldn't fully explain. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, and in doing so, had discovered a new side of himself. And the Royal Guard, once seen as a symbol of unwavering strength and discipline, had now become a symbol of something more: compassion, kindness, and the ability to act when it was needed most. The days that followed the incident with the child were not as calm as Thomas had hoped. While the Royal Guard's reputation for stoic discipline remained intact on the surface, a ripple had run through their ranks. What had once been an unspoken rule, never break character, never show emotion, now seemed uncertain. The older, more experienced guards spoke less, their eyes cast downward as if they were lost in thought. The younger ones, like Thomas, were filled with questions. Some of them, just like him, were quietly wrestling with the meaning of their actions. The public's reaction to what had happened seemed to confirm what Thomas already felt deep inside: that the Royal Guard's compassion had not been seen as weakness, but as strength. But what did this mean for them moving forward? Could they continue to fulfill their duties while showing more of their human side? Thomas wasn't sure. He had always believed that the role of the Royal Guard was clear-cut, that there was no room for personal feelings in a job so steeped in tradition. But now he wasn't so sure. The whispers in the barracks were constant. Some of the younger guards were eager to share their thoughts on what had happened, but most of the older ones remained silent. Captain Reynolds, who had initially praised them for their actions, had not mentioned the incident again, but there was a new sense of tension in the air whenever he walked into the room. The older guards, who had followed the rules for years, now seemed to be unsure of where the line was. Had they done the right thing? Were they breaking a tradition that had lasted centuries? The weight of the question hung heavily on Thomas's shoulders. He had always admired the Royal Guard for its strength, for its ability to be unmovable in the face of challenges. But now, in the quiet moments between ceremonies, he couldn't stop thinking about the child's face and the relief in the parents' eyes when they had seen their little one wake up. He had felt something stir within him, something he couldn't ignore. Compassion, care, humanity. But were these emotions compatible with the role of a royal guard? Could a soldier be both strong and compassionate? The more Thomas thought about it, the more conflicted he became. One evening, after another long day of standing still in formation, he found himself sitting alone in the barracks, staring at his boots. His uniform was immaculate as always, but inside, he felt restless. It wasn't that he regretted helping the child. In fact, he felt a sense of pride in that moment. But now, as the days passed, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake by showing emotion. What if others started to expect that kind of compassion from him again? What if it became a distraction? What if, by stepping out of character, he had opened the door to something that could change the very essence of what it meant to be a royal guard? These thoughts kept swirling in his mind, and he couldn't silence them. One afternoon, as Thomas walked through the palace grounds, he noticed a group of tourists standing near a garden, taking pictures of the palace and the guards. As they snapped photos, they laughed and joked among themselves. Thomas couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "Look at those soldiers," one of them said. "They never smile, never move. They're like statues, so serious all the time. I bet they're not even real people." The others chuckled in agreement. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. The way they spoke about the guards, as if they were nothing more than statues, made him feel distant, almost as if he were invisible. For a moment, he wondered if the tourists were right. Had they become so focused on the tradition of standing still, of being unfeeling, that they had forgotten what made them human? Was that the image the world expected them to maintain? It was moments like these that made Thomas question the role of the royal guard. It wasn't that he wanted to completely abandon the traditions that had been passed down for generations. He knew the importance of preserving the guard's legacy. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for something more, a balance between duty and compassion, between strength and vulnerability. Later that evening, when the sun had dipped below the horizon and the barracks had quieted, Thomas found himself in the company of a few fellow guards. They sat around a small table in the mess hall, the clinking of their utensils the only sound breaking the silence. They were talking about the usual topics, how long their shifts were, how the crowds had been that day, and the usual small talk that came with the job. But then, one of the younger guards, Mark, spoke up. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with the kid," Mark said, his voice low. "I mean, we did something no one expected, but it felt right. Didn't it? I've never felt more connected to the people we're supposed to be protecting." The others nodded in agreement. Thomas listened closely but said nothing at first. Mark continued. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I've always wondered what would happen if we just allowed ourselves to be more human. I know the rules, I know the history, but that moment, helping that child, it felt important. It felt like we were doing more than just standing there, like we were actually making a difference." Thomas could feel the weight of Mark's words. He wasn't the only one who had felt that shift. Slowly, the other guards chimed in, each one expressing their own thoughts about the incident. Some of them had felt a sense of pride, like Mark. Others had felt a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. There was a quiet agreement among them. Something had changed that day. The question was, what did it mean for their future as royal guards? As the conversation continued, Thomas's mind began to shift. Maybe they didn't have to abandon everything they had been trained to do. Maybe it wasn't about completely breaking character. It was about finding a balance, a way to still be the strong, disciplined guards that the nation relied on, while also embracing the humanity that made them who they were. Compassion didn't weaken them. It made them stronger, more relatable. They could still stand tall, still carry out their duties with pride, But perhaps they could also show that they cared. That night, as Thomas lay in his bunk, he finally felt at peace with the questions that had been troubling him. The Royal Guard could evolve, just as everything else in the world did. They didn't have to remain rigid, unchanging statues. They could still protect the royal family, serve the country, and stand strong. But they could also connect with the people they were guarding. They could show that they were not just soldiers, but human beings with hearts. In the days that followed, Thomas couldn't help but notice small changes among the guards. They were still as disciplined as ever, but there was a new understanding between them. They still held their posts with pride. But now, there was a quiet confidence that came with knowing they were more than just statues. They were people strong, compassionate, and ready to act when the need arose. The Royal Guard hadn't lost its sense of duty. It had simply grown stronger by embracing the full range of human experience. And Thomas, though still the same dedicated guard, knew that he had helped to shape this new understanding. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to believe that a little compassion could go a long way, both for the guards and for those they protected. In the weeks that followed the incident with the child, the Royal Guard began to change. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was noticeable, especially to those who had spent years in the barracks, following the same strict rules day after day. The change was subtle, but profound. The guards didn't stop being disciplined, didn't stop following protocol, but there was a new understanding between them. They were still the proud protectors of the royal family, but now they were more connected to the people they served. For Thomas, this shift in the Royal Guard's identity was both liberating and reassuring. He had spent so much of his training trying to uphold a perfect image, trying to suppress his own emotions and humanity. But now, he realized that it wasn't about breaking character, it was about finding a way to balance the two sides of being a guard. There was room for both strength and compassion, both discipline and care. He had always known that the Royal Guard was a symbol of national pride and tradition, but now he understood that it could also be a symbol of humanity. As time passed, Thomas noticed that the public's perception of the Royal Guard had also shifted. People still came from all over the world to see them stand in formation outside the palace. But there was a new respect in their eyes. They no longer saw the guards as untouchable statues, silent and unfeeling. They saw them as real people, capable of emotion, of care. The media, which had once only reported on the precision of their drills and the flawless execution of their duties, began to cover the moments when the guards showed their hearts. Thomas would often hear stories shared by tourists or citizens about how the Royal Guards had shown unexpected kindness, in small ways helping an elderly person across the street, offering water to a tourist in need, or simply giving a kind word when it was needed most. These stories spread across social media, and the Royal Guard's image, as a symbol of strength, began to blend with a new image, one of compassion and humanity. It wasn't always easy. There were still some in the ranks who felt uneasy about the changes. The older guards, especially, struggled with the idea that compassion might become a regular part of their duty. For them, showing emotion was a weakness, something that could potentially undermine their role. They had spent years perfecting the art of standing still, of being unmoving in the face of everything. The idea that they could show kindness, warmth, or vulnerability in public seemed to go against everything they had been taught. But even among the older guards, there were signs of change. Captain Reynolds, the very person who had guided them all through their toughest moments, had started to soften, just a little. He was still as disciplined as ever, but now there was a gentler tone to his voice when he spoke. He didn't scold the younger guards when they showed kindness or took a moment to comfort someone. Instead, he began to acknowledge that perhaps their role was not just about discipline, but about setting an example of what it meant to be truly strong. One afternoon, after a long and exhausting ceremony, Captain Reynolds gathered the entire guard for a brief meeting. Thomas stood among the other guards, waiting for the usual orders or commands. But this time, it was different. This time, Captain Reynolds looked at them with a soft smile, something they hadn't seen in a while. "I know some of you are wondering where we go from here," he said, his voice calm and steady. "The Royal Guard has always been a symbol of strength, of loyalty, and of duty. But strength isn't just about standing still, and duty isn't just about following orders. True strength comes from within, and true loyalty means caring for the people we serve." The guards exchanged looks, surprised by the captain's words. Thomas felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. It was as if a weight had been lifted. He wasn't the only one who had been questioning the traditional ways of the Royal Guard. It wasn't about abandoning the old ways, it was about embracing a new understanding of what it meant to serve. "From now on," Captain Reynolds continued, "we will continue to uphold the traditions of the Royal Guard, but we will also carry with us the strength of our humanity. We will still stand firm, still protect our royal family with all the strength we have, but we will also show that we are more than just soldiers. We are human beings, and we have hearts that beat for those we serve." The room was silent as the words sank in. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of unity among the guards. They were all in this together, not just as soldiers, but as people with real emotions and a shared understanding. They didn't have to choose between duty and compassion. They could live both truths at once. In the weeks that followed, the Royal Guard's new approach became more visible. It wasn't about large, dramatic gestures. It was in the small moments, the quiet words of encouragement, the smiles shared with visitors, the acts of kindness offered when least expected. It wasn't about breaking the rules of discipline. It was about finding ways to connect with the people they protected, to show that they cared, and to be more than just symbols of strength. Thomas, who had once struggled with the idea of showing emotion, now found himself standing tall not just because of his uniform or his training, but because of the deeper understanding he had gained. He wasn't just a royal guard. He was part of something bigger, something that went beyond tradition and ceremony. He was part of a legacy that combined both strength and compassion. The people who came to see the Royal Guards soon began to notice the difference. They saw the same disciplined soldiers standing tall outside the palace gates, but they also saw something else. They saw guards who smiled when a child waved, who helped an elderly person find their way, who took a moment to talk to the tourists and make them feel welcomed. The Royal Guard had become a symbol of something even more powerful than they had ever been before, a symbol of compassion, strength, and humanity. For Thomas, it felt like a new chapter in his life. He had learned that the true strength of the Royal Guard didn't lie in their ability to remain emotionless. It lay in their ability to protect, to serve, and to show their humanity when it mattered most. The lesson had been hard-learned, but it was one he would carry with him always. As he stood outside the palace gates one day, watching the tourists take pictures and chat among themselves, he smiled to himself. He was still the same guard he had always been, standing tall and proud. But now, when he looked out at the world, he saw it a little differently. He was no longer just a symbol of strength. He was also a symbol of something much deeper. A symbol of what it meant to truly care.